Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Comeback Kings, Seals of the Southern Ocean, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Lianne Thompson. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Lianne, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob. And welcome everyone. I am excited to talk a little bit about a couple of the seals that we can find down in Antarctica. So we will get started. Firstly, I just kind of want to talk about me. I'll introduce myself. I know I'm on camera, so you can see me. You can also probably see my cat. This is Odin. He might join in for the rest of our webinar as well. But yeah, my name's Lianne. I live in British Columbia, so live in Canada. And I did a degree in zoology, then a second one in kind of conservation education, science communication kind of stuff. So I essentially what that means is I love talking about ecology and wildlife and conservation and, sharing information about places that we are. I think it's how you can really help connect people to the natural world. So because of that, I also started working with NatHab back in 2018 and work pretty much full time for them and do a variety of different trips that we run. Do also do photography. Run some of our photography itineraries. And so it's kind of scattered throughout. I'm going to have a couple of photo tips, but it's not going to be the main focus of this webinar. But I'm going to do a second webinar kind of in June, and we'll focus a little bit more on photography and seals at that one. So the first tip, which I think is the most important thing, and it's just good to have an understanding of how Antarctica operates in general, is that there are guidelines associated with people operating tourism down in Antarctica. So there's the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, IATO is what people say it, which is why I struggled to go through with all of the words that are there. IATO sets all the guidelines. So Antarctica, when we go visit, it's not like a free for all. People can go wherever they want, whenever they want. It is really highly regulated, and all of that is with the intention of protecting this really pristine environment and the animals that do live there. So, people have to register for when they want to go to certain sites. There's regulations on how many people can go on them, when people can go. So we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end when we talk about the NatHab trips. But it kind of leads into the first photo tip, which is respecting the distance between us and wildlife and using a telephoto lens. So if you are contemplating heading down to Antarctica, then certainly you'll need to have a telephoto lens. I've had times where I've used a 70 to 200, but most of the time it would be my 100 to 500 lens that I'm bringing. So I like to kind of present that right away because you'll see some photos on this webinar and it might look like I'm sitting right next to the seal, but it's kind of a really responsible thing to talk about the lenses that we're using so people can get an understanding of how close we are to wildlife. So we always want to be doing our wildlife photography really ethically, and part of that comes with following the guidelines that's set by IATO and us as guides. We talk about this all the time because we certainly want to be respecting our wildlife at all times. So bring your zoom lenses. That is definitely the first one, and know what the regulations are. Your guides will remind you all the time, but make sure that we're kind of sticking to that. All right, so before we dive into the specific seals I want to talk about today, I think it's important for people to understand like why we find so many seals in Antarctica. If you've had a chance to go down, you might have been able to see just how many you can see, and obviously it depends on the day and the itinerary and where you end up, but there are a whole lot of seals that live down in Antarctica. So I think it's important to kind of set the stage as to why that is. So the first thing that we talk about is something called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. Antarctica, the landmass that's underneath all of the ice, the landmass itself actually used to be connected to other continents. We've got plate tectonics and supercontinents in our history, and it actually used to be connected to South America, Australia, others as well. But it kind of, when it did officially separate from Australia and South America, What it means is that we have Antarctica and then a current that can run around the entire continent of Antarctica. It's the only place in the world where we really see this, one landmass surrounded by a current. That current is really incredibly strong and actually influences the currents globally throughout our entire world. So it's something that is really important to us. But that current also helps to maintain temperatures. So if we look at the image on the right-hand side, it talks about the ocean surface temperature, and you can almost kind of see where that boundary becomes of where that current kicks in, because the temperatures around Antarctica are much, much, much colder. And so because it's colder, that water is more oxygen rich. It's able to kind of hold and support more biodiversity and more productive waters. So it links all of our oceans, but isolates these really cold temperatures. And those cold temperatures are important for a variety of different things. Of course, sea ice. I'm going to do my best to not go on different tangents because I can go on one about sea ice and about phytoplankton, but we'll try to rein it in. Sea ice obviously is, there's some that's there year round. There's some that is growing and melting every single year. But the sea ice itself actually acts as kind of like a nursery, an area for things like algae to grow. It's up near the surface. It'll have some nutrients contained within it. Photosynthesis is able to happen, and that sea ice algae is a really important food source for some tiny creatures, which we'll come to next, that kind of are the foundation of the entire ecosystem down in Antarctica. But we've got the sea ice algae also feeding into our phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is so incredibly important down in Antarctica, and we end up with these massive phytoplankton blooms. If you've ever been around one, it's pretty incredible. You can be cruising around in the water and all of a sudden your water turns green, and it's because it's so full of this phytoplankton. That phytoplankton, again, with the photosynthesis and whatnot, it's able to really flourish in these Antarctic waters. And this algae and the phytoplankton feed up into Antarctic krill. So this was the title of an article that I found once, and I thought it was so great, was that krill, the most important Antarctic animal that you almost never see. If you're looking down in the zodiacs, you might be able to scoop one up and see them, but they're really small. This is the finger. This is somebody's finger that this Antarctic krill is sitting on. So really, really, really small, but they have an incredible biomass. So Antarctic krill alone, 500 million metric tons exist within the Antarctic waters. Again, we could go off and probably do an entire webinar just about Antarctic krill, but it is a really important and crucial point of the Antarctic food web. So when we have a look at that, we've got this Antarctic marine ecosystem. We've got the sun. It helps with photosynthesis with our phytoplankton. Our phytoplankton is kind of our summer food source for our krill. That sea ice algae is the winter food source for our krill. They're really specialized to kind of cruise along the bottom of that sea ice and eat that sea ice algae. And it means that we have an abundance of krill that exists there. And you'll see in this one, and this is a very simplified version of it, obviously, but krill is feeding kind of every part, either directly or indirectly, for our entire Antarctic ecosystem. So you can see seals kind of down in that bottom corner. Krill is kind of the main component of much of their diet. Depending on the species, they also will eat some fish and some squid, but krill is kind of super duper duper important. And all of that is why we end up having so many seals in Antarctica. There is this very vast, rich food supply, so it can just support a huge number of them. But two other components that are also important to talk about is just like the lack of predators. Sometimes people think that they'll go down to Antarctica and see polar bears. If you think this, it's probably because Coca-Cola lies to you, and they do convince you that there are polar bears hanging out with the penguins. But this is not true. There are no polar bears in Antarctica. So it just means that there's not a lot of predators. We will talk a little bit about predators because, of course, there's some seals that predate upon each other. And even if you were to flick back in that previous slide, we've got our orcas that are eating some of the seals as well, but essentially there are quite few predators. And this also means then that we've got pretty safe breeding grounds. So it just means that the seals are pretty well able to flourish. And when we talk about seals, you might be familiar with the word pinniped So pinniped is kind of what we would use to say to include all of our seals, our sea lions, and walruses. And globally, there's 34 species, and they range in hanging out from tropical regions to polar regions, but most of them actually really do prefer these colder waters. And it lends itself back into the fact that colder waters are more oxygen rich, and then typically end up being a lot more productive. So and talk about these pinnipeds. And to start, I also want to talk about qualities of seals and how it is that they're able to kind of survive so well in Antarctica, because there's a lot of qualities that all of the seals will share in general. One of them is streamlined bodies. So you can kind of see it. This is not one of the seals we'll talk about today, but you can kind of see that form of the streamlined bodies. Their limbs have been modified into flippers. So we've got our side flippers, the rear ones as well, and then also the use of fur. This is something that is really important for several species, some more than others, but that fur is a really important component to life as a seal. And one thing that actually lends itself into the idea of streamlined bodies is the presence of blubber. So blubber is different than fat. And if you are a marine mammal, then blubber is better than fat. Blubber is only seen in our marine mammals, and it can be several inches thick, really, really thick layers of blubber underneath the skin, depending on the species. Because blubber, when we talk about that, we can be talking about seals, but we can also be talking about whales. Whales have blubber as well. But this blubber is vascularized, meaning that it does have blood flow, which helps because they can control that blood flow. If they're in very cold environments, they can actually restrict the blood flow, and restricting blood flow then helps to maintain their core temperatures. Because if you've got warm blood leaving the core of your body, heading out and warming your blubber and therefore warming your skin, then that's an invitation to heat loss, right? So if you're living in cold areas or you're swimming in cold water, then you'd want to restrict your blood flow. So having blubber allows for that restriction of blood flow, and therefore they're able to maintain their core temperature much warmer than their skin. The blubber also has connective tissues and fibers, which makes the structure much more rigid, and this helps with that streamlined body. So, fat is a little bit more like jiggly and it moves, and if you are an animal that needs to swim and relies on being very dynamic and moving around in those waters, you want to be streamlined, and so having the rigidity of the body helps with that streamline. And of course, blubber does also act as an energy store. So it's similar to fat in that way, that they can use their blubber as an energy store in times when it's quite difficult to obtain resources. And then lastly, blubber is also something that's really helpful in terms of maintaining buoyancy. So when we talk about fat in our seal species, then for the most part, we're talking about blubber, but sometimes those words will be used interchanged, but they are actually quite different. Other things that seals will all do is that they spend most of their time living in the water. They're marine mammals, and we looked at that marine ecosystem, and all of their food sources are then in the water. So it's important for them to be able to spend that time in the water. Their bodies are highly designed for that. And then they'll come ashore to ice or just onto land, and that depends on the species. And they'll do that to mate, give birth, molt, escape from predators. I'm sure you've seen a variety of different videos that are available of seals using ice as a platform to escape predators, sometimes successful, sometimes not. But yeah, it's in a really important platform for them. But seals, they spend a lot of time in the water, and this then you might think, I think about this, like, how do these animals rest? And I think it's quite fascinating to think about our seals and their sleeping. And sometimes they're spending an abundance of time in the water and are not coming out onto land or onto ice. And so they do something called unihemispheric sleeping when they are in the water. And what this means is that half of their brains sleep at each time. So humans, we don't have a very good survival tactic when it comes to sleeping. I don't know about you, but for the most part, when I fall asleep, I'm pretty dead to the world. My cat runs around on top of me sometimes, and I will be completely asleep for it. Not a very good survival tactic. But if you are an animal living in an environment where your predators are around, and maybe you don't have a nice little house around you that helps to protect you from things, then you need to figure out a different tactic. So they will do unihemispheric sleeping. So they will rest the right side of their brain, the left side remains active and aware, and then they can swap. So pretty impressive that they can just rest half a brain at a time. And then when they come on land, they actually can rest fully because they're out of the aquatic environment and for the most part away from any potential predators. So kind of interesting that they can convert back and forth between those. But yeah, a nose for diving. This is something that's super cool, and I'm sure that wherever you live or in your travels, you've probably seen seals at some point. I'm in North America. I've spent a lot of time around like harbor seals. They're pretty prominent around coastal regions in North America. And if you go back and look at some of your pictures, I encourage you to look at what they're doing with their nose. Because if you're an animal that lives in the water, then it's important to have some certain adaptations for that. So one of them is that their nose is adjusted for it. So on the right hand side, we have a seal and it's got its nose closed. And this is actually the relaxed form for them. So whenever they're not thinking about it, they're not actively doing something, their nose will be closed. That makes total sense for an animal that needs to be swimming around in the water. If those nostrils are open, water gets in, havoc is wreaked. That won't work very well for them. So the relaxed pose is to have their nostrils closed versus on the left hand side, you can see their nostrils are open. So that is when the muscles are contracted and they're actively keeping those nostrils open. So obviously they need to do this in order to breathe, but quite fascinating because we wouldn't think that that's how it would be normally given what our nose structure is. But then you'll also sometimes find in your photos that you'll have a seal that has half it's opened and half of it's closed. So some of this can come from the idea of wanting to like fine tune the oxygen intake that they're doing it. They do have asymmetrical muscle control, and that kind of comes along with that unihemispheric sleeping. I've also heard that there is a theory proposed that having one open and one closed also aids in the idea of thermoregulation, because if you've ever been somewhere where it's cold, you take a deep breath, your nostrils can freeze shut, it can get very cold. And so for animals living in cold environments, it's important that they're able to kind of thermoregulate their way around that. So if they've got one open, they can still get oxygen coming in, but maybe control the flow and not allow so much cold air in. So quite fascinating, really. We'll go back to this one. I know we've already seen it, so I'm kind of done talking about what qualities we all share as seals or pinnipeds in general. But from here, I want to break pinnipeds down. And you've already kind of got an indication for it on the right-hand side, but that there are three families within the pinnipeds. So we have our eared seals, we have our true seals, and we have our walruses. Now, there are no walruses in Antarctica, so we're not talking about them anymore. Today, we're going to talk about one-eared seal species and one true seal species. The webinar that I'll do later is also going to talk about more of our true seals. If you don't know what seals exist in Antarctica, here's a lovely little graphic for it. So today we're going to focus on our elephant seal and our fur seal, but in a few days we'll talk about, or in June, we'll talk about leopard seals, crab eater seals, and Weddell seals. I don't talk about Ross seals because they're pretty hard to see because just dependent on where people go. It's just not a very common seal species that people will see, whereas the other ones are pretty common. As I said, today we're going to talk about the Antarctic fur seal and the southern elephant seal. And one thing that these two seals have in common that's different than the other seals is where they choose to come on shore and the fact that they do choose to come on shore. So these two both create massive land aggregations, huge populations, huge colonies that will come on land versus our other seals. It's not to say that they never come on land, but they're using ice a lot as the platform. So that's kind of how I've separated these two out because they also form large colonies on land. Both the southern elephant seal and the Antarctic fur seal, they also both were victims of some mass amount of hunting. If you've got animals that aggregate on land, it's a lot easier for people to hunt. So these two, when we talk about the comeback kings, we're talking about that because of the massive amount of hunting that happened with them kind of in the 1800s, even into the 1900s until about the 1960s. the massive hunting that was going on with these, and then we'll talk a bit about the population recovery that's happened since then. But these are our two species that we're going to focus on. So we'll start with the Antarctic fur seal. So this is one of them, just kind of basking away here. They are our eared seal. So you can see in this picture, I've easily pointed it out, that you can see the external ear, and the family, like otarid, comes from the Greek word that means little ear. So they, that's exactly where it's come from, and that's why we've got here. And for a photo tip on this, I think it's really fun when we have seal species that all seals might look the same, right? It can be hard to identify them. Let's find some of the features that make each one of them unique, and then you can focus on those details. So for the Antarctic fur seal, one of them is the fur, which we'll come to in a little bit, but the other one obviously is that ear. So I liked the opportunity of kind of highlighting that a little bit more. With our eared seals, they also have these front flippers that are typically much larger and are used in a different fashion than our true seals. So our Antarctic fur seals, being an eared seal, they have these front flippers that they're able to prop themselves up with. That's seen in this photo here. And those front flippers also help them with climbing. They're not like expert climbers by any means, but it does mean that they tend to get a lot higher up than any of the other seals. And I was able, we watch them even on like an ice floe that they can climb up to the top. Sometimes I'm looking at a seal and it's like, how did you get here? I don't quite understand, but they are pretty good at using those front flippers on land, prop themselves up, and then can climb with them. And then I just spoke a bunch about blubber, but one thing that's quite unique about our Antarctic fur seal is that they actually have much less blubber than our other seal species. So instead, they rely on this really, really dense fur. It's hard to figure out exactly how dense their fur is. I've read several different numbers, but one of the ones that kind of came up most consistently was that their fur is about 300,000 hairs per square inch. And so because they've got such dense fur, then it means that the water that they've surrounded themselves in actually never reaches into their core. So instead of using blubber that they can control blood flow to keep them warm, they use this fur. So they'll have an outer fur, these guard furs, and then they have an inner fur that's kind of almost a bit more like down with birds and their feathers. So the idea of this inner fur is that it traps warm air at their body, and then this outer fur that's extremely dense, helps to prevent the water from even getting in. And it's said to be about 300 times more dense than like human hair. Obviously, that might depend on how much hair you have on your head, but really, really dense hair, really, really dense fur that they've got on their body. And that was the target for the hunting, was this fur that people were wanting to use. In terms of diving and locomotion, because they have these front flippers that are much longer, they swim differently than our true seals as well. So we've got this image on the right-hand side, and it kind of talks about the flapping motion of those flippers, and that's how they will swim, versus our other seals. They're using their rear flippers, and they will kind of swim a little bit more like a fish in the water. So kind of undulating their body versus flapping those flapping those flippers in the water. So it kind of helps with their speed there. I think it's also really fun to think about how these seals might sense their world. So when we talk about eyesight, when we talk about the components of our eyes, we have rod cells and we have cone cells. Our cone cells are used for color, but then our cone cells also require light. Our rod cells, they don't really require light because we don't see in color very much, but it does give us our night vision. So, these guys will have an abundance of cone cells, but more rod cells than cone cells. And again, this makes sense because if you're an animal living in an aquatic environment, if you've ever dove down deep, it gets pretty dark down there. So the rod cells are going to be much more prominent in our seal species. Hearing as well is something to talk about, that they've got hearing adapted to be useful both in air and in water. And if you think about your ears, if you've ever tried to hear underwater, our ears are not designed for that. So it's quite cool to think that animals are adapted to be able to hear well outside, in air, as well as in a water environment, which is not at all something that we have. Whiskers, they're something that are really fun to talk about with our Antarctic fur seals, because they do have these really long whiskers. We'll see ones on other seals, but I find these Antarctic fur seals to be quite impressive with their really long whiskers, and they're being used to help sense their world as well. Any movement that happens within those whiskers when they're swimming in the water column, water moves around them because perhaps there's fish or a whole area of krill that's kind of moving around. Then it moves those whiskers and sends information to their brain, so it helps them detect and understand movements in the water world that's around them. So the whiskers, super important. Um, Statistics. I usually throw this on because people love to know how much animals weigh. I will admit that this is probably the information that stays in my brain the least. For the most part, I think an animal's weight is like specific weight is some of the least interesting facts about them. However, obviously there are things that are really cool to think about. So with our Antarctic fur seals, males are much, much larger than our females, so about 4 times larger. And we'll get into a little bit about that shortly. But yeah, we've got our very large males. Lifespan, males also living quite a bit less than our females. But one of the things that I want to talk about with this photo is about capturing the environment. So it's a photo tip here. I know I have a tendency of getting in and seeing these animals and wanting to zoom right in on some of these features, right? One of the last tips was focus on the details, but then it's equally important sometimes to come and step back. And I find that being forced into that with the IATO regulations and wanting to make sure that we're maintaining distance, it lends itself quite well to being able to capture more of the environment. So here we've got this Antarctic fur seal that we know likes to haul out on beaches. So we've got a rocky beach here, the water behind it, some of the mountains of Antarctica behind. I think it's really fun to kind of incorporate all of that in together. All right, so we'll talk more about their mating system and how they exist. It is a polygynous system, and this is why our males would be so much larger than our females. The males will come onshore first. They establish their territories earlier in November, and they will fight fiercely between each other. It is not a simple feat. They will, target after each other, and the idea is that one single male will kind of control a harem of females, so a group of females. And the hope behind that for that dominant male is that only the dominant bull, only that dominant male is breeding with his females. So he will be really, really protective of those females. However, they have done some research and looked at the offspring of these things and found that it's almost only the dominant males that do get to breed. There will be some males that will hang out kind of on the outskirts of these harems, of these protected colonies, and say you've got a dominant male that's distracted by another dominant male and they're fighting it out. Then you have kind of these sneaky males on the outside that might come in and breed with the females. Sometimes the females will also kind of sneak away from the harem a little bit, get further away, especially again when those males, the dominant male is distracted, and might mate with other males. So in general, when we've got a dominant male and they can have a harem of, 7, 12, 20, they can have quite a few females that are kind of under their control. The dominant male will be the father to most of the male or most of the offspring, but not all of the offspring. I think it's a fun tactic to think about how they can maintain this mating system and this mating structure, but also consider genetic variation and kind of the desire for that. When it comes time for pupping and breeding, so I said how the males are coming on shore in November. The females actually come on shore a little bit later. So they would come in, and shortly after coming on shore, they actually give birth to last year's offspring. So gestation period is kind of a debated topic within our seals, but it's a year-ish, but there's a delayed implantation in there as well. It's a kind of a whole thing. We can do a different talk on that one, but Um, they will give birth, they'll come on land, they give birth to last year's offspring, and within a week of giving birth, then breeding season occurs. The female will still be there caring for her pup. They'll be nursing them for up to 4 months, and during this time, the pups are very loud. It's not a quiet area to be in. Communication between a female, like a mother and pup, they have to be able to isolate these individual calls and know each other really well, because they are wanting to support their offspring for that time period. So they'll be on land. These pups will be nursed. They will go through molting themselves, so that they can prepare for going off into the winter. Because yes, we see birthing in December, but we have to reverse our brains to think that December, for many of us, again, depending on where you are, is winter, but in Antarctica, this is the summer season. So they give birth in kind of an early summer and then nurse throughout most of the summer, and will go. Everyone goes off in the winter time, which is kind of coming up to now, in terms of our time frame. So the females themselves, they will go in and be feeding. They'll go off and they'll go feed and they'll go collect food and come back. One thing I actually didn't mention was that when those males are needing to protect those harems, they can lose a massive amount of weight because they have to stay on land that whole time. So it makes sense why our males would be so much larger for multiple reasons. One, obviously being larger is going to help with battling and being dominant over other males for control of a harem, but also having a lot of weight on your body means that you've got a lot of blubber reserves to feed off of while you're on land needing to kind of protect that harem. So they can lose a massive amount of their body. And then I want to talk about the population. So it is quite difficult, really, to find out exact numbers of what our populations we think that they might be at prior to sealing and collection of seals. But in many areas, it's believed that the Antarctic fur seal was actually close to extinction. The bulk of Antarctic fur seal breeding actually happens in South Georgia. So those huge, massive harems we would see in South Georgia, but we do still see a bunch of fur seals kind of along the Antarctic Peninsula and in the South Shetland Islands. And in some of those areas, including South Georgia, including the South Shetland Islands, including the peninsula, there are many areas where they became nearly extinct. Populations disappeared because it would be where people were having their stations. Again, if you're an animal that aggregates and creates these colonies on land, it's an easy target to go after and hunt. So near extinction that existed. Hundreds of thousands of these fur seals would have been harvested each year, but kind of since like the 1960s is a really big turning point in terms of our whale harvesting in Antarctica, as well as our seal harvesting in Antarctica was a big shift because of the way that they are breeding. They're quite successful at it, and now it's estimated that there could be between 4 and 5 million individuals. In many areas where they'd previously been, their populations have recovered enormously, but there are still a couple of low pocket areas where they're still not doing great, but they obviously have rebounded a lot. So in terms of like comeback kings, our Antarctic fur seal really, really takes the cake on that one. They have rebounded incredibly since the loss in numbers as a result of the hunting of them. From there, I do want to move on to our other seal. I'm trying to keep an eye on our time as well. And this one is our elephant seal. Now, our fur seals, we see them quite a bit more on the trips. The elephant seals, their populations are a little bit more restricted. You don't find them all over the peninsula versus the Antarctic fur seals. I kind of joke that they almost become part of like the soundtrack to Antarctica. They are quite vocal, as I said, with their pups, but they make kind of almost like puppy whimpering noises quite often that we would see them. So you see them, the southern elephant seals, they're much more difficult to see. So a bunch of the southern elephant seal photos, a couple of the Antarctic seal photos are not mine because these ones are just a bit harder to see, but they are really fun to see. I'm sure you've heard of them. They've got this massive proboscis on their face. That's the males. So they're pretty well known. They are a true seal. So again, we've got our eared seals, our true seals, our walruses. So these guys would be a true seal, meaning they don't have that external ear flap. They are the largest pinniped in the world, and I talked about how statistics are quite boring. But when it comes to our southern elephant seal, it is quite interesting. Males can be up to 4,000 kilograms. Like, how wild is that? Think about how absolutely massive that is. And then our females are much lower. So then we have huge sexual dimorphism. And here, this is not even a true depiction of this. This is like a large male, but certainly not like a big, giant, dominant male that exists here. But it can be a photo tip that I use, and I look for things for scale. And scale is something that we talk a lot about in photography in a variety of different ways. But to use the example of an animal that has this huge sexual dimorphism where the males and the females look so different from each other, you can just use individuals within the same species to find that scale. So really, really cool. But huge, enormous pinniped. These ones, they do kind of have some funny land movements. This video, I was almost going to take it out, but I said to Rob I should just keep it in for comedic effect, to just watch seals move on land. So I know I spoke about with the fur seals that they've got these front flippers that are quite large, and that they're different from a true seal. Many of our true seal ones, they'll have smaller front flippers, but these guys, again, because they're in a species that's on land, they can use them to help with movement. But quite funny to look at them moving there. Uh, our southern elephant seals are known for their diving. Longest of any pinniped, they've been known to dive for close to 2 hours and a depth of 2 kilometers. So pretty incredible that they are able to do that. And some of that comes from what their diet is. So a lot of squid, fish, but then also some other deep sea prey. And I already spoke at the beginning of some of the qualities that all seals share. And we're going to do more in terms of what their diving is. But of course, all of these things will be quite adapted for our southern elephant seal specifically, because they are so well known for their deep, deep dives. So how are they adapted to dive in these waters and be underwater and for that long of a time frame and even go that deep? So some of that comes from a reduced heart rate. So our southern elephant seals do this to the extreme. They can get down to like 3 beats per minute when they're at these depths. And this, of course, helps conserve oxygen, and as a result then is able to help increase our dive time. They've got a large circulatory system, more blood volume than other mammals, but they also have a higher amount of hemoglobin and myoglobin. And if you're familiar with those at all, these are things that are in your body as well. We've got hemoglobin, myoglobin, and it helps to deliver and transport oxygen throughout our bodies. And if you're an animal that needs to dive, you just have a massive amount more of the hemoglobin and of the myoglobin, so that you can ensure that oxygen transfer to your muscles and throughout the whole system is it's enhanced even more. Um, the other thing, we can go back to the nose here. This is one of my favorite things about seals. You look at them, and depending on your photos, they can look incredibly snotty. And even with this one, it's got quite a bit of the snot there. This is not snot. It's actually something called pulmonary surfactant. And it all has to do with lubricating the respiratory system. So as a diver, you'll know that the pressure changes from air, and as we dive deeper and deeper, things can collapse, the pressure increases, and then when you come back up, then you've got, the pressure changes, and then our, things would expand again. And so they need to make sure that their respiratory system is properly lubricated, so that when the changes in pressure happen, things are kind of collapsing and expanding, it's able to do so in an easier way. So we see this snotty pulmonary surfactant that comes out, and that's what it's there for. Is it's to help aid in the diving process. And with seals, they also exhale before they dive. So what do you do before you take a dive down? Right? You take a big breath of air so that you can try and dive for longer, versus our seals will do the opposite. True with whales as well. They exhale everything before they dive. This is to help reduce buoyancy. Again, if you're a diver, you know lots about how your breath changes your buoyancy. If you want to dive deeper down, you got to be less buoyant. So having less air will help with the buoyancy. It also helps to limit the decompression sickness. Again, and experienced divers will know about this and how, when we dive, we have to come up and do these safety stops, and all of that's to help with preventing decompression sickness. So one of the tactics for these guys is to do that exhale before. And in here, I say photo tip of telling a story. And I feel like I've kind of done that with this photo. Sure, it's not a photo of an elephant seal underwater swimming, which would, also be an incredible shot to get. But even when they're on land, you can look at some of these features and kind of build a story about an elephant seal's life based on being able to see, that snot coming out and what their nostrils are. So I think guides really help a lot with that because we can share some of that information. I mean, who knows about pulmonary surfactants and myoglobin and hemoglobin and how the muscles of a nose work for a seal unless you go and research it or unless you've got kind of a guide sharing that stuff with you. And I think it all helps to kind of build the story of how these animals are super well adapted for life down here. Communication as well. So again, we can go back to the southern elephant seal with this massive nose, this big proboscis. The males are the ones that have it, and they use it for communication. So they've kind of force air through a nasal cavity and expands this proboscis like a balloon, and it increases the resonance of the sound and helps that sound travel a lot further. I've read things that the sound of it can reach over 100 decibels, which again I got compared to being louder than a rock concert. So very, very loud colonies can travel massive, the sound itself can travel very far, both on land and in water. And they're using this as a form of establishing dominance and creating those territories. And so we can talk about that with our elephant seals. You've maybe heard this terminology of becoming a beach master, because when we talk about the Antarctic fur seals, and okay, cool, maybe they've got up to a dozen, maybe 20 females. That sounds impressive. But the southern elephant seal, they can control harems of females of over 100 females. So massive, massive number of them. But in order to do that, you do have to be an incredibly dominant male. So again, our males come earlier on in the season. They will establish these harems. They will become a beach master. You can see in this photo, this is not my photo, but I found this one on the internet and I think it's pretty cool. That shows this bloody system that exists here. So huge, huge battles and fights, and they really, really, really mean it. And it's something like only 1 in 10 males will actually become a dominant male that'll become a beach master. So really not many of them will exist. So yeah, not a lot of beach masters happening here, but they come in, they establish their territories. It's also a polygynous system, so the males will breed with many, many females. So they dominant male, they can sire dozens of offspring. So really significant in terms of being that. With these ones, they will also nurse for up to 3 to 4 weeks. The females will lose a huge amount of their body weight as well. And the survival rate of this massive seal, which is kind of crazy to think of, is actually not that high. Some of them can imagine being in a harem. You've got 100 females, you have dominant males, other males coming in and kind of battling things out. Some of these pups can actually just get squished from the chaos of these massive harems. But one other thing that's recorded quite a bit is leopard seals. Leopard seals is going to be a topic that I talk about in the June webinar, but they are kind of a predatory seal. So they would be going after our seal pups as they're kind of starting to go into the water. So not a huge success rate, which is kind of surprising. One thing that makes our southern elephant seals unique among the Antarctic seals is that they go through something called a catastrophic molt. You would hear this term also referencing the penguins that exist down in Antarctica, but the catastrophic molt when it comes to our southern elephant seals is shedding all of that fur, but also shedding a layer of skin as well. Now, our other seals also undergo a molt, but it's not considered a catastrophic molt because it tends to be a little bit more gradual and a little less kind of horrific and jarring looking. So when our seals are going through this catastrophic molt, it can be like a 3 to 5 week process. They're coming on land, they're shedding everything off. So it happens over like a really short, relatively short period all at once. So that's why it's kind of considered this catastrophic molt. It'll be happening more in late summer, early autumn. And one of the reasons why they believe that the southern elephant seal has to go through this catastrophic molt versus the other kind of more gradual molt is because of their deep diving, their longer migrations, the wear and tear that all that takes on its body. Because that's ultimately why animals undergo a molt, is because they need to do a refresh, make sure that they're going to be warm, it's going to be weatherproof. And if you're an animal diving down into like super big depths, then doing that molt just becomes a little bit more necessity. Obviously, this is a huge energetic cost as well. So when they're on land, again, kind of losing more of that weight, and which is why we have just these massive animals and these thick fat reserves. Uh, in the era of hunting for these guys, theirs is different. It's not like the Antarctic fur seal where they were hunted for their fur. These guys, you can probably imagine, were hunted for their fat, for that blubber, for that oil that could be used by people. So used in oils for like lamps and lubrication, industrial purposes, so a whole lot of it. Again, these guys kind of targeting more around South Georgia, Falkland Islands kind of area, and that's a lot of where their breeding area is. But the South Shetlands are another spot for seeing them too. They would be processing hundreds to thousands of these in a single season, and yeah, lots of death for these ones. This one I found even more difficult to try and find what our estimates are for our populations prior to and current. Their comeback has been really impressive, but it's kind of a story that's still unfolding because their numbers haven't rebounded quite to what we think their previous numbers would have been. So population estimates can be anywhere between kind of 650,000 to 800,000. So they've come back a lot. Again, impressive, since they're areas where they would have been considered extinct or nearly extinct to come back. But it's still kind of a story being written about their conservation. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about for seals, but just to dive in like really briefly, because I know we want to have time for questions about the trips that NatHab offers. There's still space for next season, so that would be 2025, 2026. I think I'm in the right years there. There's kind of a couple of different options that you can do. We've got this kind of more expedition yacht style that is suitable for 12 passengers, and then we have these motor sailing yachts that actually have even smaller numbers, so only about 7 people. The trips can range from being sailing through the Drake, flying in areas, so lots of different options and then different lengths that you can choose to come and hang out down here. But within any like an experience coming down with us for Antarctica, you kind of experience a few different things. So each day we would go out on different excursions. So these would include zodiac cruising. So obviously we would need to get from the ships, from the yachts onto land. And so we use zodiacs for that. And sometimes you can just cruise around in the zodiacs. You can have areas where there's an abundance of whales. We can have an abundance of seals, a whole lot of stuff. And so we can do that, like hang out in our zodiacs and just cruise around looking for wildlife. This is another good photo tip, and that is preparing for conditions. So in terms of talking about zodiac cruising, and then we'll talk about land cruising and hanging out and like actual getting feet on the land. All of it is dictated by our weather. Antarctica is not an area where it's just sunny and warm and low winds all the time. That doesn't exist. Every single day the conditions can be different. Certainly we have days that are sunny and warm and calm, but you know, later that afternoon, an hour from now, and days from now, you can experience strong winds, even the waves that are created, the currents, all of that kind of stuff. You can get wet on the Zodiac. So, in terms of preparing yourself, making sure that you've got waterproof gear for that, but also preparing for your camera gear. For me, I don't want to be changing a lens on a Zodiac just because the conditions are quite unpredictable. And even on a calmer day, you never know what might happen that can create some spray. So I will always make sure I'm picking a lens that I feel like I'm comfortable with. And typically it is kind of more that telephoto lens. If my target is to go after taking photos of animals. Of course, you can use a more wider angle lens if it's a cruise where maybe you're around really impressive icebergs and you're wanting to kind of capitalize on that type of photography. But I also look at things like what is the weatherproofing of my camera gear as well. I find something to be super important. And things will probably get a bit wet, a bit damp. Bringing down like silica packets or stuff to help kind of reduce the water that gets in is something that I think is also quite helpful. So oh, Zodiac cruising, sorry, I guess. Put that more. Yeah, Zodiac cruising, go look for whales, go look at icebergs. It's a really fun thing to do. But we also have landing sites, and this will be getting off the ship, taking the Zodiac, going onto a landing site, getting feet on the ground. You can step on the continent of Antarctica. And largely for this, it's going and visiting our penguin colonies. Penguins can be many other webinars that I'm sure we could do. But one thing that's really special about NatHab trips is the small groups. If you look at some of the other ships that go down, they'll have a lot more passengers, and so you'd be sharing a landing site with that many people. But with NatHab, they are sharing these landing sites with only a small group of people, right? You've got 7 people that's wandering around on land together versus maybe 100. Yeah, so considering that with the NatHab trips, it does make it really unique and really special. Being the smaller ships, we're also able to get into areas where some of the bigger ships can't go, and it allows for a lot of flexibility. So I mentioned at the beginning with the IATO stuff that these landing sites, they will be designated landing sites, and we have to kind of book them. But being a small group, there's a lot of flexibility to get in and see a lot of areas of Antarctica. Um, I've mentioned this several times already. June 10th, I should have double checked that, but I'm pretty sure that's the date that I have. Will be seals part 2. So we'll talk about leopard seals, crab eater seals, and Weddell seals. What makes them different, what makes them unique, some photography tips, storytelling, and stuff more on that. But that's everything I've got. So I'll pass it over to Rob, and hopefully we've got time for a few questions. Sorry I talked so much.
All right, Leanne, thank you so much. Before we do start in with the question and answer session, would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. Just go to the upper right-hand corner, click on those 3 lines, and you'll see the question field. Go ahead and put your questions in there. So let me ask you this, Leanne. Can you talk about what the life cycle is for the krills, and are they prolific breeders?
Yeah, the krills is quite an interesting one. I did have a slide. I took it out. I should have kept it in. The krills, yeah, so they can live for a few years. And in the wintertime, as they said, they actually have specialized like components where they are able to kind of cruise along the bottom of the sea ice, eat that sea ice algae, breed. And then the juveniles, they actually sink down in the water column with their breeding cycle, the larvae, and then as they kind of grow up and become adults, they end up resurfacing up to the more top of the water column. So we can see a bit of ebb and flow in terms of krill and the feeding that happens with them. So there's still always an abundance amount, but yeah, it's kind of interesting that the juveniles, the larvae, they sink down further and then they come back up. And yeah, I had another thought in my brain, but it left almost immediately. But yeah, they're just a huge, really, really important part of the ecosystem. Those krill feeding on that phytoplankton and feeding the rest of it. But it's quite a fascinating system with the krill.
Is human harvesting of the krill for supplements, is that an issue, or is there any endangering the krill population by that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the biomass of Antarctic krill is so enormous, but of course, any harvesting of them for people takes away from the from the krill that's available for the wildlife that relies on it down there. So there are krill fisheries that are down in Antarctica. So it is certainly something that plays on people, and there's a lot of fighting against having the krill fisheries and allowing them. So, you can participate in trying to prevent krill fisheries from happening because it all has to do with supply and demand. So, krill oil is used in a ton of different things, things that we use, pet foods, like lots of different stuff. So, doing some research on where krill oil is, what products you might use that has krill oil, and then trying to choose products that don't use krill oil is one way that you can help kind of prevent, like reduce the demand for krill oil, and then hopefully prevent the krill oil fisheries from continuing down in Antarctica. Because, yeah, of course, if we're harvesting krill, it means less food for the animals that live there.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. So, is there any danger for adult males or females to actually kill the pups of the seals? Does this
Yeah,
happen?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mentioned that quickly with the southern elephant seals, but you can like watch videos of even watch a penguin video trying to have this penguin move through a colony, and you watch the chaos that's happening. And if you've got this 4,000 kilogram male southern elephant seal collapsing down on these much smaller pups, yeah, it's definitely a thing that happens. Which to me is it seems so counterproductive. Like, how is this still a system that is existing if they're killing their own young based on their fights? But yeah, I mean, it is, yeah, definitely it's a thing that happens.
Great. Thank you for that. So, how long would an elephant or a fur seal maintain their dominance before there's another one who would have their chance to pass on their genetic line?
So it is not something that even can maintain necessarily throughout an entire breeding cycle. So if you've got like a beach master, a really dominant southern elephant seal beach master, they use that term specifically for southern elephant seals. They could end up being a beach master for several years, but that doesn't mean that just because someone's become a beach master that other battles and fights aren't still happening throughout breeding season. So it's totally dependent on the male, how dominant, how big, how aggressive they are, and the others that are nearby. But like the fights happen throughout breeding season in general as well. So it's not like in November, I've staked my claim, here I am, boss man of this area, nothing else is going to come in. Other males will still be coming in and fighting for that territory too. So.
Great. Thank you. So, were there concerted efforts to help seal populations repopulate? Was there preventing of hunting for seal fur or blubber? How has that changed?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reduction in reliance of people on the need for harvesting of both whales and seals for their blubber, as well as the reduction in demand of having furs for people, all of that kind of lended itself into the just reduced need of hunting them. But also, it's come into the people wanting to put a value on their lives in a different way. So it's something we talk about in tourism a lot, and I think really, really relates down to Antarctica because nobody lives in Antarctica. And so anytime people are going there, of course, we're having an impact, right? It's impossible to be down in Antarctica without having an impact. But by people choosing to go there and view these animals alive, it puts a value on their lives being worth more alive than dead. So tourism can have a huge protection because if, say, tourism were to stop happening in Antarctica, one of the proposed things that could happen is people going down maybe and hunting more, but probably more likely would be using the land and exploiting the land for resources. But if we're exploiting that land for resources, then it displaces a whole lot of animals. So tourism is a really great way of being able to help conserve them. But there were also regulations that went in, protections that went in place, and made it so that we couldn't be hunting anymore. So yeah, it's been a huge part of it.
Great. Thank you for explaining that to us. So, is the southern elephant seal a different species or a subspecies from the elephant seals found on the California coast?
Um, there is northern elephant seals and southern elephant seals. So our southern elephant seals, they are restricted down in like Antarctic areas, subantarctic islands, versus there are northern elephant seals, which I will admit that I don't know the full range of the northern elephant seal, but perhaps it's those ones that we have there, because southern elephant seals are exclusively down in Antarctica and subantarctic islands.
Gotcha. So would you say that Antarctica is more prolific with life than, say, the Arctic is?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, Antarctica is so, it does have so, it's teeming with life down there, but the polar regions, being colder areas, you can talk about phytoplankton blooms in both, and, the prevalence of sea ice and the growth, the annual growth and decline of sea ice and how that contributes to the ecosystems. They mirror each other very well. They're both extremely prolific. And it's why, whale watching, I also guide NatHab trips in Iceland, and we go whale watching in Iceland. And there's a reason why our polar, colder waters are areas where we're going to have just an abundance of that life. So I don't necessarily want to say that like one is more prolific than the other, because they're both just extremely prolific. And it's probably also something that at this point it's really hard to research. The Arctic region is studied a lot more than the Antarctic region. It's just easier to get to. There's more access to it, so it's less expensive. Not to say that it's cheap, but less expensive. Studying and researching down in Antarctica is incredibly difficult and very expensive. So one of the things that I learned a lot being in Antarctica was like, oh, okay, let me Google this, let me find out this piece of information, and it was a lot of we don't know, because we just don't have the information, we don't have the research that's done down there. So to fully be able to grasp how productive these waters are and kind of compare them, I'm sure that there are things that have done it and will extrapolate and attempt to do the comparison, but we probably don't really have a grasp on it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Leanne. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Hopefully you learned some about Antarctica as well as the seals down there. Like I said, we'll do another webinar in a few months, a couple months, to continue talking more about that. And I'll talk more about like sea ice and that way that it contributes to the ecosystem down there as well, the influence it has in your daily lives. But yeah, hopefully you learn more about Antarctica. If you're keen to get down there, it's such a beautiful, spectacular place to go. I know it's difficult to get to. I know it's expensive, but let me tell you how worth it is. It's pretty incredible. So thanks for everyone for joining, and maybe see you around the globe sometime.
Leanne, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel to Antarctica with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. And if you're part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, email us at webinars@nathab.com. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.